Good morning. Excuse me. Uh, I finished with my series on Paul Morphy and the First American Chess Congress. So I thought about it, and as a student of chess history, I think there's only one place to go after the uh, First American Chess Congress, and that is to the U.S. Championships from 1964-65. I think 64-65. It's 63-64. uh, where Bobby Fischer scored a remarkable 11 out of 11. So I'll be looking at all Fischer's games. I'm just giving the game away, he wins all 11. But it doesn't mean there won't be some excitement along the way, despite the fact that we already know the results from before. It's just such a fantastic achievement, and some of the games are brilliant. And I think the first game here where Fischer plays black against Edmar Mednes uh, shows shows just how much of a struggle it can be, even for a great player like Fischer. So we'll just begin. Mednes plays e4, Fischer plays e5, knight to c3, knight to f6, and bishop to c4. I know we've seen a lot of Spanish games with bishop to e5-4, but at this period of time, bishop to c4 was very popular, the Italian game. It's still the second most popular opening in chess, behind behind the Royal Lopez. And I think in third place comes the Queen's Gambit. Anyway, so Fischer plays bishop to c5, standard Guico piano, which is Italian and means the quiet game. This is the main line, very pop. This is c3. This is to give white the chance to play d4 and to make a break in the centre. Very popular, as well as d3, the Guico pianissimo, which is Italian for even quieter game. It's not quiet. Anyway, so Fischer develops a piece, of course, and Mednes takes the centre. Yeah. So now he's got two pawns in the centre, and Fischer plays bishop to b4 check, so, because it was attacked, and also because it gives him a check. And then the bishop is played, and he takes the bishop, plays the says check, and then he takes the Mednes takes with the knight. Knight takes on e4. This is a version of the centre fork trick. Obviously, when he takes with the knight, Fischer has pawn to d5, winning back his piece and leaving white with an isolated pawn. And this game really, the first part of the game is about that positional weakness in white's structure. But he doesn't take back straight away. He plays the queen to pin the knight. It's the same. So he plays d5 still with a threat. And he takes the pawn, so he takes the knight, so he's now temporarily a piece up. This is often called a temporary piece sacrifice or a pseudo piece sacrifice. He's not really giving a piece away because he's getting it back very soon and it isn't costing him anything. So knight takes. Fischer doesn't take yet. He realises, and I think this is a really good lesson for us all as chess players. He has a capture on c4 or e4. He can't move them both at the same time. That means if he can make a move that doesn't make his position any worse, that it makes it better, then he can delay that capture for one more move. And Mednes castles queenside. Now, I think if we look at the evaluation, it will say it's completely even, just zeros here. But from my point of view as a not expert, just thinking about it, then the king going to the queen side, he already has a weakness on his queen side with the isolated pawn. Does he want to abandon his queenside pawns to his kingside pawns? Because actually, as we see this played out, a lot of pieces are going to get swapped off very quickly. So Fischer plays bishop to g4. Again, he doesn't take the piece. He can play another move. It's still there. He doesn't have to. He can play a move which pins the opponent's knight, threatens to damage his pawn structure. And now the pawn moves to threaten the bishop. Now Fischer takes on f3. Now, if he takes with the queen, then the bishop is then undefended, and when Fischer takes with the pawn, he will be a pawn up. So, therefore, he takes with the pawn. And now, all right, he does have an open file. Medinus does have an open file against the opponent's king, and but he does have an isolated pawn here, doubled and isolated pawns here, and an isolated pawn here. Theoretically, this should be an endgame win for white, for black, sorry. But just try and have a little guess what the engine says about this position. I'm not going to guess because I know from before what it already is. Because I've just checked the graph of the game. I wanted to be sure and myself what point it was that the game turned in favour of Fischer. Yeah, so if we look at the analysis, we'll find very slight, almost a pawn advantage to black. But you could think it was a lot more because of the things that I've just explained. And it's only that advantage if he takes on e4 and lets white repair his pawns. Fischer doesn't do that. He takes on c4 and doesn't let white repair his pawns. And if we look at the analysis, it will now say 0.36. It's almost completely level. Can we say that was a mistake by Fischer? No, really. Alright, he might have given away some of his advantage, but this is an extremely difficult position for white to play. And he's under pressure the whole rest of the game. So, Medinus takes back the pawn, and the queen comes to h4, with the threat of coming to f4, check, and winning this pawn. So, Medinus moves his king even further away from these very weak pawns. You can imagine, if all the pieces, or most of the pieces, get swapped off, then these pawns are going to be very weak, and these well organised pawns are going to be very strong against that. So, Fischer goes about making that happen. So he plays queen to f4 anyway, because it's still a threat on the pawn on f3, which is still reasonably difficult to defend. So Medinus plays d5, and yeah, already it allows a fork on the e5 as a fork on the knight and the queen. But he gets a pawn on c7, and he can't take the pawn because the knight gets taken, and he can't take the pawn with the knight because the queen gets taken. So has he made a mistake? Not really. He moves rook to c8. You might think, oh well, no, he can take the b pawn. If he takes the b pawn, the rook is going to come here, and wherever the queen goes, no, it's not going to end well. For instance, if he takes the pawn, rook comes here, the queen comes back to where it was, then immediately he's got rook takes pawn check, king doesn't. If the king takes, he has knight to c5 check, and picks up the queen. Or sorry, knight to d3 check. c5 is covered by the queen. Knight to c3 check, opening up an attack on the queen by the queen. So he can't afford to take that pawn. So he plays rook to d6, and Fischer plays rook to d8. And Medness comes back to c7, and the rook comes back to c8. Are we going to see a repetition of moves? Did I lie? Is one of these games a draw? No, of course, none of these games are a draw. So he comes to c6, d6 again, but now he comes with the other rook, which guarantees the queen has to leave this diagonal, allowing either the knight or the queen to win the pawn on f3, leaving 3 isolated pawns. So the situation will be that both players have 5 pawns, but that Medness has 4 islands of pawns. This one on its own, this one, and these two together, whilst Fischer has 2 islands. These 2 and these 3 together. We know who has an endgame advantage here. But even at that, it isn't an easy endgame advantage to succeed. So he plays queen to d7, e7. It's a good square because it guarantees that he's got to take the pawn with the knight. Can't take with the queen or he loses the knight. So he does indeed take with the queen, and the pawn comes forward. It's just 2 squares away from queening. Has Fischer miscalculated badly here? No, not at all. So the knight comes back to where it was to cover the square d7. Does this plan work? No. This plan of threatening taking the pawn. Rook comes here. No, because even if he doesn't go into the trap, knight to c4 is still going to be a very powerful attack. And you know, once the knight is cut off, when he plays queen to c7, when the rook comes here, the queen has to play here to keep defending the knight, and not a good square. It's a forkable square. It can be forked on. Yeah. So if he takes here, rook comes here. He has to keep defending the knight. Queen comes here, and when the knight gets to here, I know it's a long way off, but when he gets to here, it's a fork on the queen and king, and the pawn is pinned. So he defends the knight with the rook, thus threatening to take the pawn. Rook comes to d7, defending the b pawn and preparing for an eventual doubling of the rooks. So the queen comes to g5 and it's swapped off, and when the knight moves, the knight is threatened. Great move here by Fischer. He defends the knight and threatens the opponent's knight at the same time. Brilliant. Forces the knight to move and gives his king an escape square. Luft. Fantastic. Achieving so much with the little move f6, and not making a Ben Fingal turn in his grave, because he wasn't around then. I don't think he was born in 1963. I was 2 years old. I remember it well. Of course I don't. Anyway, so brilliant move f6. Knight comes to e4, and the knight comes to g6. I thought we said he wanted to be covering this square. He wants to cover it from a more stable square. On e6, e5 even, the knight can be chased away by a pawn to f4. But now he's in a position, before this pawn gets attacked anymore, to come to f8 to defend this d7 square to prevent the queening. So it's a better, more stable square. So the rook comes and swaps off. He swaps off, and the pawn comes here. What is the point of this mysterious move? The point is that when the rook comes here to threaten to take off the knight, then the only pawn which is threatened is this one, and he can move that pawn when he gets an opportunity. He doesn't need to take the pawn. If he takes the pawn, he's just going to be giving his opponent a new queen. So of course he comes to c7, and the knight comes to the more stable square f8. No, it can't be chased away. No, the queen can't be forced to b1. In fact, it might be the other way around. It might be such that black is threatening to chase away the knight, which is the only defender of this pawn. So the king comes nearer to the centre, and the king comes nearer to the centre, and the king comes nearer to the centre, and the king comes nearer to the centre. Wait a minute, no fork here. The pawn is covering it. Another advantage of the b6 move. And now he might at some point in time be able to move these two pawns, and then this pawn, and then in this position he can swap off the rooks because his king comes to d7 and prevents the queen from castling. So once he's moved those pawns, he's threatening to take the pawn and win the pawn which currently stands on d6. So the knight's threatened, and now it comes to g6, and the king comes into the middle, and the pawn comes to h6. The plan, as I said, is to move these pawns so that if he comes here with the rook again, if he's cheeky enough to do that, then Fischer can take and win the d pawn, which would then be a c pawn. A check, which is good, forces the king away from its defence of the queen. Now he isn't any longer in a position to swap off rooks if it gets here. He would first have to play king here, and then he gets checked again. So he has to find another solution to that problem. And now he goes to f5, looking to play knight to d6, e6 even check. But he's threatening also at the same time the pawn on h3. So the pawn moves. And now black moves his pawn, and he's still got a lovely pawn structure against a weak pawn structure. So Medness threatens a pawn, but Fischer says no, I'll threaten your knight instead. And the rooks get swapped off, and now he's in a position to go about winning a pawn as Fischer. He takes that pawn first, but that doesn't win him a pawn, because the knight comes to b5 and gets the pawn back. King comes to d7. Yeah, doesn't come to c6, because if it comes to c6, then when the pawn gets taken, it would be check. So he saves the tempo by going to d7 directly. And now he threatens the h pawn. If Medness pushes the h pawn, Fischer pushes past and then comes to f4 with the knight to win the pawn on h5. So he comes to a more central position with the king, and now Fischer is a pawn up. There's 4 against 3, but this is a really well thought endgame by Medness. But you know what it's like. You've been in these endgames yourself. You don't win them, and if you're against a good enough player, he finds the correct method to win here, and Fischer finds the correct method to win. So the idea is to keep all these pieces together and advance slowly, one by one. And actually, it might not look like it, but the king and pawn are perfectly capable of stopping these two pawns. Even with the support of the knight, it can stop them. So the knight comes to g6, but it's heading to e5, a wonderful central square. Pushes the pawn, plays the check first, and then takes away more room for his, from the opponent's king, and manages to keep the pieces and the knights and the pawns together in advancing them. And now the knight comes to e5, and he might be threatening to play e4, h4, h5, h5, h4, maybe even h3. He's also got a threat on this move of playing knight to d3, threatening this pawn. So Magnus is looking at this square to fork two different pawns. The king comes c6 to prevent that fork, and he advances. The knight comes over to say, well, I can have some influence on how it goes with these pawns, and the pawn is pushed. I think that both pushing the g pawn and taking the f pawn lead to draws here. There's only one winning move, which is to support the two pawns, so that whatever happens, you've got at least two pawns together passed. So the knight chases the pawn chases the knight away, and the knight comes to e5, and now he's threatening to win the pawn on f3. So he takes and he takes, keeping the pawns together. And again, it's still not easy, this game, but Fischer makes it look relatively easy. The check, and then the knight comes here, so that this knight can't move or he'll lose this pawn, and the king can come here to defend these two pawns. And you might think, well, yeah, then he comes here and threatens this pawn. It doesn't do any good, because when he plays knight takes pawn, he defends this pawn, and he can abandon that pawn and play knight takes pawn, play knight to c3, abandon the pawn and win this pawn, and then he's got two pawns and a knight against a king and knight. But the king comes, of course, nearer to the pawns to support them, and the king comes so it's in a position to chase the knight away from the c3 square. So plays a check first, and great, this is the first time where he says, yeah, you can take my knight, because you won't stop my pawn. Wait a minute, if he takes the knight, pawn comes here, knight comes here, stopping the pawn, but pawn comes here, threatening the knight has to go here, and the pawn comes here, and then he's threatening the knight. And knights are really bad at stopping pawns. So if you got a rook on the pawn, a knight on the 8th rank, a pawn that threatens to take it diagonally, and so it can't cover both the square that it's, it can't stay there because it gets taken, and when it moves it leaves open the square by the side of it, allowing a new queen. So he can't take the knight on a d3. So he plays the pawn to the king to f3, and the rook comes to e1 to chase it out of there. And again, he pushes the pawn, and it's impossible for him to take the knight to a new queen. So he comes to f2 to stop that pawn from queening, and Fischer comes to f3. Medness resigns. The king eventually will come and support those pawns. He can check the king away from there, get his own king to g3, and then push the pawn to f2, supported by the king, say check, and get a new queen. There's nothing to do on this side of the board, and even trying to make this break, it's not going to work, because he's got time to come here and say check here first. Yeah, he can say check here. He can't take because he gets a new queen. So if he pushes the pawn here, he checks first, pushes the king into the corner, and then he's defending against the pawns, and he can come here with his king, and even if he gets checked, he can come to this dream square g3, and then he will be winning. So it's unstoppable. You can't stop both pawns from queening. He can stop one or the other, but he can't stop both, and he won't get home with these pawns in time. So yeah, with that, Fischer won his first game in the 63-64 US Championships. Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe to my videos. Thanks. Bye.